The shrill scream pierced through the air, causing heads to turn in the bustling mall. Karen, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, stood there accusingly, pointing a finger at the cowering young maid standing next to her. "You thief! You stole my bag!" Karen shrieked, her face contorted with rage. The maid, Maria, trembled in fear, her eyes wide with panic. "No, no, I didn't take anything, I swear," she pleaded, her voice quivering. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Karen whirled around, glaring at the onlookers. "Don't just stand there, call the police. This maid has stolen my expensive designer bag," she demanded, her voice dripping with entitlement. Maria's heart raced as she watched helplessly, unable to defend herself against Karen's accusations. Suddenly, a security guard approached the scene, having been alerted by the disturbance. "What seems to be the problem here?" the guard asked, looking from Karen to Maria. "This maid stole my bag. I want her arrested immediately," Karen shouted, her face flushed with anger. The security guard held up his hand, trying to calm the situation. "Let's not jump to conclusions here. Perhaps we can review the security footage and get to the bottom of this," he suggested. Karen huffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Fine, but I want her fired and thrown in jail for what she's done," she said, glaring at Maria. The security guard motioned for them to follow him to the security office, where they could review the CCTV footage. As they waited, the tension in the room was palpable. Maria kept her head down, her hands trembling, while Karen tapped her foot impatiently, her expression a mix of anger and smugness. Finally, the security guard returned, a puzzled look on his face. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the footage, and it appears that you're the one who took the bag, not the maid," he said, addressing Karen. Karen's eyes widened in shock, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "What? That's impossible. I would never steal anything," she protested, her voice rising in pitch. The security guard shook his head and gestured towards the monitor, where the footage clearly showed Karen surreptitiously slipping the bag into her own purse. "I'm afraid the evidence speaks for itself. We'll have to contact the authorities and hand over the footage," the guard said, his voice firm. Karen's face turned beet red, and she glared at Maria, who had a small smile of triumph on her face. In that moment, Karen realized that her entitled behavior and false accusations had backfired spectacularly, and she had been exposed as the true thief. The security guard wasted no time in contacting the police, who arrived within minutes. Karen stood there, her arms crossed defiantly, as the officers reviewed the CCTV footage and questioned her. "Ma'am, the evidence clearly shows you taking the bag. We have no choice but to place you under arrest for theft," one of the officers said, his voice stern. Karen's eyes widened in panic, and she tried to defend herself. "This is all a mistake. That maid must have tampered with the footage or something. I would never steal," she exclaimed, her voice shrill. The officers shook their heads, unimpressed by her desperate attempts to shift the blame. "We have the footage, ma'am." "You're coming with us," the officer said, reaching for his handcuffs. As the officers led a struggling Karen away, Maria watched with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had been falsely accused of theft, and the tables had turned in the most unexpected way. The once confident and entitled Karen was now reduced to a helpless criminal, facing the consequences of her own actions. Later, at the police station, Karen found herself sitting in a cold, metal chair, her wrists still in handcuffs. The officers had been unforgiving, and she had been booked on charges of theft and making false accusations. As the reality of her situation sank in, Karen's mind raced. She had always been the one who got her way, the one who could manipulate and bully others into submission. But this time, her tactics had backfired spectacularly, and she was facing the very real possibility of jail time. Panic and desperation began to set in, and Karen knew she had to do something to get herself out of this mess. She thought about calling her wealthy and influential friends, trying to use her connections to get the charges dropped. But deep down, she knew that this time, her privileged status wouldn't be enough to save her. Suddenly, an idea struck her. Maybe she could try to plead for leniency, to play the victim, and manipulate the system once again. After all, she had always been able to charm her way out of trouble in the past. With a renewed sense of determination, Karen decided to put her skills to the test, even as she faced the very real consequences of her actions. As Karen sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, she carefully composed herself, determined to play the part of the innocent victim. When the officers returned, she greeted them with a sorrowful expression, her eyes brimming with tears. "Officers, I'm so sorry for all of this. I'm just a busy, hard-working woman who got confused and made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to understand. I would never intentionally steal anything. It must have been an accident." The officers exchanged a skeptical glance, unimpressed by Karen's attempted display of remorse. "Ma'am, the evidence clearly shows you deliberately taking the bag." "Your story doesn't match the facts," one of the officers said firmly. Karen's facade of innocence crumbled, and her eyes hardened with frustration. "You don't understand. I come from a wealthy family, and I've never had to worry about money. I would never stoop to stealing, especially not in public. This is all a terrible misunderstanding," she argued, her voice laced with desperation. The officers remained unmoved, and one of them leaned forward, his expression stern. "That's precisely the problem, ma'am. Your sense of entitlement and privilege seems to have blinded you to the consequences of your actions. The law applies to everyone, regardless of their background." Karen felt her heart sink, realizing that her usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation were failing her. She had always been able to use her wealth and status to avoid accountability, but this time, the officers were not swayed by her pleas. Desperate, Karen tried a different approach. "Officers, please, I have a family to support. If I'm arrested, it will ruin my life. Isn't there some way we can make this go away?" "I'm willing to pay whatever it takes," she said, her voice dripping with desperation. The officers shook their heads, their expressions unwavering. "Ma'am, I'm afraid that's not how the justice system works. You'll have to face the consequences of your actions," one of them said, signaling to the other officer to escort Karen to the holding cell. As she was led away, Karen's facade of composure crumbled, and she couldn't hold back the tears of frustration and fear. Her world was unraveling, and she couldn't believe that her privileged status had failed to protect her this time. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and Karen found herself facing the very real possibility of a criminal record and potential jail time. As the hours ticked by in the cold, austere holding cell, Karen's mind raced with a mix of panic and desperation. She had never imagined herself in such a situation, a wealthy, privileged woman reduced to a common criminal, facing the harsh reality of the justice system. Karen paced the small confines of the cell, wringing her hands nervously. She thought about calling her influential friends, her well-connected lawyers, anyone who could help her escape this nightmare. But deep down, she knew that her usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation were no longer viable. Suddenly, the sound of the cell door opening startled her, and she looked up to see a stern-faced police officer standing in the doorway. "Mrs. Karen, the judge is ready to see you now," the officer said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. Karen's heart sank, and she reluctantly followed the officer to the courtroom, her mind racing with thoughts of how she could possibly escape this predicament. As she stood before the judge, Karen's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for a familiar face or a potential ally. But all she saw were the impassive expressions of the court officials and the unforgiving gaze of the judge. The judge cleared his throat and fixed Karen with a penetrating stare. "Mrs. Karen, you stand accused of theft and making false accusations. How do you plead?" Karen took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "Your Honor, I plead not guilty. This is all a misunderstanding, I swear." I would never intentionally steal anything, she said, her voice wavering. The judge raised a skeptical eyebrow. The evidence presented by the police would suggest otherwise, Mrs. Karen. The CCTV footage clearly shows you taking the bag from the maid. Karen felt her heart sink as the judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom. She knew that this time, her usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation were not going to work. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the judge was not going to be swayed by her pleas of innocence. As the judge continued to question her, Karen's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this predicament. But with each passing moment, the reality of her situation became more and more clear. She was facing the very real consequences of her entitled and unethical behavior. As the judge pressed on with the proceedings, Karen's desperate attempts to defend herself only seemed to dig her deeper into trouble. Her usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation were proving futile in the face of the overwhelming evidence against her. Realizing that her pleas of innocence were falling on deaf ears, Karen decided to try a different approach. She took a deep breath and straightened her posture, her expression suddenly shifting from one of panic to a calculated display of remorse. Your Honor, I understand the gravity of the situation, and I take full responsibility for my actions, she said, her voice laced with feigned humility. I made a terrible mistake, one that I deeply regret. I swear it was never my intention to steal or to falsely accuse the maid. I'm truly sorry for the disruption I've caused. The judge regarded her with a skeptical expression, clearly unconvinced by her sudden change in demeanor. Mrs. Karen, your actions have not only violated the law, but have also caused significant emotional distress to the maid you wrongfully accused. Do you have any remorse for the harm you've inflicted? Karen hesitated, her eyes darting around the courtroom as she searched for the right words. Of course, Your Honor. I understand the gravity of my actions, and I'm truly sorry for the pain I've caused. I was simply overwhelmed and not thinking clearly. But that's no excuse. I take full responsibility, and I'm willing to make amends in any way I can. The judge's gaze remained unwavering, and Karen could sense the skepticism emanating from the court officials. She knew that her usual tactics of manipulation and deflection were not going to work this time. She had to dig deeper, to find a way to tap into the judge's sense of empathy and leniency. Swallowing her pride, Karen lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I come from a privileged background, and I've never had to face the consequences of my actions before. But I'm willing to learn, to change, to make things right. Please, show me mercy. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make amends and ensure this never happens again. The courtroom fell silent as the judge considered Karen's words. For a moment, Karen dared to hope that her plea for leniency might have struck a chord. But as the judge's expression remained unreadable, she braced herself for the worst, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The anticipation in the courtroom was palpable as the judge contemplated Karen's plea for leniency. Karen held her breath, her eyes fixed on the judge's impassive expression, hoping against hope that her attempt to appeal to his sense of empathy had worked. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the silent room. Mrs. Karen, I have carefully considered your words and the gravity of the situation. While I appreciate your sudden display of remorse, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Karen felt her heart sink as the judge continued, his voice stern. Your actions not only violated the law, but also caused significant emotional distress to an innocent person. Your sense of entitlement and privilege has clearly blinded you to the consequences of your behavior. The judge paused, his gaze piercing through Karen's facade of contrition. However, I am willing to offer you a chance at redemption, but on one condition. You must make amends to the maid you wrongfully accused. Karen's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope, and she nodded eagerly. Of course, Your Honor. I'll do anything, I promise. The judge held up a hand, silencing her. This is not a trivial matter, Mrs. Karen. You must demonstrate genuine remorse and a willingness to change. The maid has agreed to meet with you, and I expect you to make a sincere apology and offer restitution for the harm you've caused." Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had expected a harsh punishment, but the judge's offer of redemption was an unexpected lifeline. She nodded, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor. I will not let you down. I'll make things right, I swear." As the bailiff escorted her back to the holding cell, Karen's mind raced with a mixture of emotions. She was relieved to have avoided a more severe punishment, but the prospect of facing the maid she had wronged filled her with a sense of unease. This was uncharted territory for her, humbling herself and making amends to someone she had once treated with such disdain. Yet, as she sat in the cold, confining cell, a glimmer of self-reflection began to take root. Perhaps this was an opportunity for her to truly change, to learn from her mistakes and become a better person. With a newfound determination, Karen resolved to make the most of this chance, no matter how difficult it might be. The day of the restorative meeting with the maid, Maria, arrived, and Karen found herself filled with a sense of trepidation. As she sat in the small conference room, the weight of her actions bearing down on her, the door opened, and Maria tentatively stepped inside. Karen's heart raced as she met the maid's gaze. Maria's eyes were cautious, guarded, yet there was a hint of curiosity in them. Karen cleared her throat, her hands trembling slightly. "Maria, I want to start by sincerely apologizing for the way I treated you," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "What I did was wrong, and I'm ashamed of my behavior. I never should have falsely accused you of theft, and I'm sorry for the pain and distress I've caused you." Maria remained silent, her expression unreadable. Karen took a deep breath and continued, "I know that my words may seem empty, but I want you to know that I am truly remorseful. I've had a lot of time to reflect on my actions, and I realize that my sense of entitlement and privilege blinded me to the consequences of my behavior." Pausing, Karen reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This is a check for the full value of the bag I took, plus an additional amount to compensate you for the emotional distress I've caused. It's not much, but I hope it's a start in making amends." Maria's eyes widened as she accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen leaned forward, her eyes sincere. "Please, Maria, I understand if you can't forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing. I've learned a valuable lesson from this experience, and I'm determined to be a better person going forward." Silence filled the room for a moment, and Karen waited with bated breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Karen. It means a lot to me that you're willing to take responsibility for your actions. I accept your compensation, and I hope that this experience will lead you to a better understanding of the impact your behavior can have on others." Karen felt a weight lift from her shoulders, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Maria. I promise I will do whatever it takes to make this right and to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." As the two women left the conference room, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. Perhaps through this humbling experience, she could finally begin to shed her entitled mindset and become a more compassionate, empathetic person. In the weeks that followed, Karen found herself undergoing a profound transformation. The events at the mall had shaken her to her core, forcing her to confront the ugliest aspects of her own behavior. As part of her court-mandated community service, Karen volunteered at a local shelter, where she encountered people from all walks of life: the homeless, the struggling, the disenfranchised. It was a humbling experience, one that opened her eyes to the harsh realities faced by those less fortunate than herself. Gone were the days of Karen's entitled, self-centered mindset. Instead, she found herself genuinely listening, empathizing, and trying to understand the struggles of those around her. The change was not easy, and there were moments when she felt overwhelmed and tempted to revert to her old ways. But with the support of her court-appointed counselor and the maid, Maria, whom she had wronged, Karen persevered. She made regular donations to the shelter, volunteered her time, and even began advocating for greater support and resources for the underprivileged in her community. One day, as Karen was organizing donations at the shelter, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was Maria, her expression warm and welcoming. "Mrs. Karen, I'm so glad to see you here," Maria said, a genuine smile on her face. "I want you to know that I've been impressed by the changes I've seen in you. It's not easy, but you're truly making a difference." Karen felt a rush of emotions, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. "Maria, I can't thank you enough for giving me a chance to make amends. If it weren't for you and the judge's compassion, I don't know where I'd be. This experience has changed me in ways I never thought possible." The two women embraced, their differences forgotten, united in the belief that growth and redemption were possible, even for the most entitled and misguided. As Karen continued her journey of self-discovery and community service, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But she was determined to use her newfound empathy and understanding to make a lasting impact, to be a force for good in the world. And in doing so, she hoped to find the peace and fulfillment that had eluded her for so long.